Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we continue in The New Science by Giambattista Vico. We are in the first section and on subsection 22, paragraph 79, entitled Orpheus, and with him the Age of the Theological Poets. And with that, I'll get started. This Orpheus, who reduces the wild beasts of Greece to humanity, is evidently a vast den of 1,000 monsters. He comes from Thrace, a country of fierce warriors, Marti, Marsus, not of humane philosophers, for the Thracians were through all later time so barbarous that Androtion the philosopher removed Orpheus from the number of sages simply because he had been born in Thrace. And yet in her beginnings he came forth so skilled in the Greek language that he composed in it verses of marvelous poetry, with which he tamed the barbarians through their ears, for though already organized in nations, they were not restrained by their eyes from setting fire to cities full of marvels. And he finds the Greeks still wild beasts, though Deucalion, 1,000 years before, had taught them piety by his reverence and fear of divine justice. On Mount Parnassus, in front of the temple raised to divine justice, which was later the dwelling of the Muses and Apollo, the god and the arts of humanity, Deucalion with Pyrrha his wife, both with veiled heads, that is, with the modesty of human cohabitation, meaning marriage, sees the stones that lie before their feet, that is, the stupid brutes of the former savage times, and make them into men by throwing them over their shoulders, that is, by the discipline of household economy in the state of the families. Helen, too, 700 years before, had brought the Greeks together by means of language, and had sown the 3 dialects among them by means of his 3 sons. And the house of Inachus could show that it had founded its kingdoms 3 centuries before, and had continued the royal succession through that period. Finally comes Orpheus to teach the Greeks humanity, and from the savage condition in which he finds it, he brings Greece into such splendor as a nation that he is a companion of Jason on the naval enterprise of the Golden Fleece, naval enterprises and navigation being the last discoveries of peoples, and he is accompanied on this expedition by Castor and Pollux, the brothers of Helen, for whose sake the famous Trojan War was fought. So in the life of one man so many civil things are accomplished, for which the extent of 1,000 years would hardly suffice. Such a monstrosity of Greek chronology in the person of Orpheus is like the other 2 we have observed above. One in Assyrian history in the person of Zoroaster, and another in Egyptian history in the 2 Hermeses. It was perhaps because of all this that Cicero, in his On the Nature of the Gods, suspected that such a person as Orpheus never existed in the world. Paragraph 80. To these great chronological difficulties may be added others no less serious of a moral and political nature, for Orpheus then founds the humanity of Greece on the examples of an adulterous Jove, a Juno who is the mortal enemy of the virtues of the Herculeses, a chaste Diana who solicits the sleeping Endymions at night, an Apollo who gives oracular responses and pursues to the point of death modest maiden Daphnes, a Mars who, as it were not enough for the gods to commit adultery on earth, carries it even into the sea with Venus. Nor is this unrestrained licentiousness of the gods satisfied by forbidden intercourse with women. Jove burns with wicked love for Ganymede. Indeed, this lust reaches the point of bestiality, and Jove, transformed into a swan, lies with Leda. This licentiousness practiced on men and beasts was precisely the infamous evil of the outlaw world. Many of the gods and goddesses in heaven do not contract matrimony at all. One marriage there is, that of Jove and Juno, and it is sterile, and not only sterile, but full of atrocious wrangling. Jove, indeed, fixes in the air his chaste and jealous wife, and he himself gives birth to Minerva, who springs from his head. And finally, Saturn, if he begets children, devours them. Such examples, powerful divine examples as they are, though such fables may contain all the recondite wisdom desired by Plato, and in our time by Bacon and Verulam in his Wisdom of the Ancients, if taken at face value, would corrupt the most civilized peoples, and would incite them to become a bestial of the very beasts of Orpheus. So apt and efficacious they are to transform men from the state of beasts to that of humanity. In view of these things, it is a very slight reproof that St. Augustine makes of the gods of the Gentiles in his City of God, apropos of the scene in the Eunuch of Terence, in which Chiara, tempted by a painting of Jove lying with Danae in a shower of gold, summons up the hardihood, which he had lacked, to violate the slave girl with whom he was so madly and violently in love. Paragraph 81. But these treacherous reefs of mythology will be avoided by the principles of this science, which will show that such fables in their beginnings were all true and severe and worthy of the founders of nations, and only later, when the long passages of years had obscured their meanings, and customs had changed from austere and dissolute, and because men, to console their consciences, wanted to sin with the authority of the gods, came to have the obscene meanings with which they have come down to us. As for the rough chronological tempests, they will be cleared up for us by the discovery of poetic characters, one of whom was Orpheus, considered as a poet-theologian, who through the fables in their first meeting, first founded and then confirmed the humanity of Greece. This character stood out more clearly than ever in the heroic contest with the plebeians of the Greek cities. That was the age in which the poet-theologians distinguished themselves, as for example Orpheus himself, Linus, Musaeus, and Amphion. The last of these, with self-moving stones, i.e. the doltish plebeians, erected the walls of Thebes, which Cadmus had founded 300 years before. Just as Appius, grandson of the Decemvir, about as long after the foundation of Rome, fortifies the heroic state for the Romans by sinking to the plebs the strength of the gods and the auspices, the knowledge of which was held by the patricians. From such heroic contests the heroic age got its name. Section 23. Hercules, with whom the heroic time of Greece reaches its climax. Paragraph 82. The same difficulties recur for Hercules, if we take him for a real man, and the companion of Jason in the expedition of Colchis, and not as we shall find him to be in respect of his labors, a heroic character of the founder of peoples. Section 24. Sanchuniates writes histories in vulgar letters. Year of the world, 2800. Paragraph 83. Called also Sanchuniathon, and entitled The Historian of Truth, on the authority of Clement of Alexandria in his Stromata, he wrote the history of Phoenicia in vulgar characters, while the Egyptians and the Scythians, as we have seen, wrote in hieroglyphs, as the Chinese have been found to do down to our own days. The latter, like the Scythians and the Egyptians, boasted a monstrous antiquity, because in the darkness of their isolation, having no dealings with other nations, they had no true idea of time. And Sanchuniates wrote in vulgar Phoenician characters at a time when vulgar letters had not yet come into use among the Greeks, as we have said above. Section 25. Trojan War. Year of the world, 2820. Paragraph 84. This war, as it is recounted by Homer, is thought by circumspect critics never to have taken place, and authors like Dictys of Crete and Dares of Phrygia, who as historians of their time gave prose accounts of it, are by these same critics relegated to the library of imposture. Section 26. Sesostris reigns in Thebes, year of the world 2949. Paragraph 85. This king brought under his empire the 3 other dynasties of Egypt, and is evidently the king Ramses, of whom the Egyptian priest tells Germanicus and Tacitus. Section 27. Greek colonies in Asia, in Sicily, and Italy. Year of the world 2949. Paragraph 86. This is one of the very few things in which we do not follow the authority of chronology. Constrained by an overpowering reason, we put the colonies brought by the Greeks into Italy and Sicily about 100 years after the Trojan War, and thus 300 years before the time at which the chronologists place them. That is, about the time where the chronologists place the wanderings of the heroes, such as Menelaus, Aeneas, Antenor, Diomed, and Ulysses. Nor should this cause surprise, when they, the chronologists, themselves vary as much as 460 years in dating Homer, the author nearest to these affairs of the Greeks. Our reason is that in magnificence and delicacy, Syracuse at the time of the Punic Wars had nothing to envy Athens itself, and luxury and splendor of customs reached the islands later than the continents. The Croton of Livy's time calls forth his compassion because of its small number of inhabitants, when it had at once a population of several million. Section 28. Olympic Games, first founded by Hercules, then suspended and restored by Isiphylus. Year of the world 3223. Paragraph 87. Since it is found that the years were numbered by Hercules from harvest to harvest, but from Isiphylus, i.e. Iphitus, one by the course of the sun through the signs of the zodiac, exact chronology among the Greeks begins with Isiphylus. Section 24. Founding of Rome, Year of Rome 1. Paragraph 88. But just as the clouds are dispersed by the sun, so all the magnificent opinions that have been held up to now concerning the beginnings of Rome and of all other cities that have been capitals of famous nations are dispersed by this golden passage of Varro, quoted by St. Augustine in his City of God, that Rome, under the kings who reigned there for 250 years, subdued more than 20 peoples, and did not extend her empire more than 20 miles. Section 25. Homer, who came at a time when vulgar letters had not yet been invented, and who never saw Egypt, year of the world 3290, and of Rome, year 35. Paragraph 89. Regarding this first slide of Greece, we have been left in the dark by Greek history in both its chief aspects, geography and chronology, for nothing certain has come down to us regarding either his fatherland or the age in which he lived. In our third book, we shall find him quite different from what he has been thought up to now. But whoever he was, he certainly never saw Egypt, for he says in the Odyssey that the island on which there now stands the Pharos of Alexandria was as far from the mainland as an unloaded boat with a north wind and the poop could sail in an entire day. Nor did he see Phoenicia, for he says that the island of Calypso, Ogygia, was so far away that Mercury, a god and a winged god, could get there only with great difficulty, as if it were as far from Greece, where the gods reside on Mount Olympus, as he himself sings in the Iliad, as America is from our world. So if the Greeks in the times of Homer had had dealings with Egypt and Phoenicia, he would have had lost credit in both his poems. Section 26. Psammeticus opens Egypt, but only to the Ionian and Carian Greeks. Year of the world 3334. Paragraph 90. It is from the time of Psammeticus that Herodotus begins to relate better ascertained facts about the Egyptians. This confirms our opinion that Homer did not see Egypt, and the various items of information that he narrates about Egypt and other countries of the world are either things and deeds that took place within Greece, as we shall show in our section on poetic geography, or they are traditions altered by the passage of a long time of the Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Phrygians, who had colonized among the Greeks, or they are tales of Phoenician travelers who traded on Greek shores long before the time of Homer. Section 27. Aesop, vulgar moral philosopher, year of the world 3334. Paragraph 91. In the section on poetic logic, it will be found that Aesop was not an individual man in nature, but an imaginative type or poetic character of the socii or family of the heroes, who certainly came before the 7 sages of Greece. Section 28. 7 sages of Greece, of whom one, Solon, ordains popular liberty in Athens, another, Thales the Milesian, gives a beginning to philosophy with physics. Year of the world 3406. Paragraph 92. Thales began with too simple a principle, water, perhaps because he had seen gourds grow on water. Section 29. Pythagoras, of whom according to Livy not so much as the name can have been known at Rome during his lifetime, year of the world 3468, and of Rome, year 225. Paragraph 93. Livy puts him in the time of Servius Tullius, so firmly did he believe that Pythagoras had been the teacher of Numa in divinity. And in these very times of Servius Tullius, almost 200 years after Numa, he says that it was impossible, because of the barbarous character of inland Italy in that era, not merely for Pythagoras himself, but even for his name to reach Rome from Croton, passing through so many peoples of varying languages and customs. It may thence be inferred how quick and easy were the really long journeys of Pythagoras to visit the disciples of Orpheus in Thrace, the Magi's in Persia, the Chaldeans in Babylonia, the Gymnosophists in India, then on his return the priests of Egypt, and after crossing Africa at its widest, the disciples of Atlas in Mauritania, then crossing the sea, the Druids in Gaul. Thence he is supposed to have returned to his fatherland, rich in what Hearn calls barbarian wisdom, from those barbarous nations to which long years before Hercules the Theban, slaying monsters and tyrants, had gone on his civilizing mission about the world. Nations to whom the Greeks bragged, a long time after, that they had taught culture, but not to such profit that they did not remain barbarous. So sound and weighty is the succession of the schools of barbarian philosophy related to the aforesaid Van Hearn, which the vanity of scholars had much applauded. Paragraph 94. Need we go so far as to appeal here to the authority of Lactantius, who firmly denies that Pythagoras was the disciple of Isaiah? This authority is strongly supported by a passage in the Jewish Antiquities of Josephus the Jew, which proves that the Hebrews in the times of Homer and Pythagoras lived unknown to their nearer inland neighbors, to say nothing of remote nations overseas. For when Ptolemy, Philadelphia, expressed surprise that no poet or historian had ever made any mention of the Mosaic laws, Demetrius the Jew answered that some who had attempted to tell the Gentiles about them had been miraculously punished by God. Theopompus, for example, had lost his mind, and Theodectes his sight. Josephus himself, in Against Appian, freely admits their obscurity, and gives these reasons for it. We do not live, he says, on the seashore, nor do we delight in trading or in having dealings with foreigners for the sake of trade. Lactantius reflects that this custom was a counsel of divine providence, so that the religion of the true God might not be profaned by trafficking with Gentiles. In this opinion, Lactantius is followed by Peter Vanderkoon in his De Republica Hebraicarum. It is all confirmed by public confession of the Hebrews themselves, who, in expiation of the Septuagint, held a solemn fast each year on the 8th day of Tebet, which is our December, because when it was finished, there were 3 days of darkness over all the world. According to the rabbinical books referred to by Casaubon, Exhortationes in Baronium, Buxdorf, in Synagoga Judaica, and Hottinger, in Thesaurus Philologicus. And because the Grecicizing Jews, called Hellenists, among them Aristeas, who is said to have been in charge of it, claimed divine authority for this translation, the Jews of Jerusalem mortally hated them. Paragraph 95. But by the nature of these civil things, it is to be considered impossible that over confines such as those whose trespass was forbidden even by the highly civilized Egyptians, who were so inhospitable to the Greeks that, even a long time after they had opened Egypt to them, it was forbidden to use a Greek pot, spit, or knife, or even to eat meat cut by a Greek knife, over harsh and forbidding paths, without any language in common. And among the Hebrews, of whom it was proverbially said by the Gentiles that they would not so much as point out a fountain to a thirsty foreigner, the prophets should have profaned their sacred doctrine by making it acceptable to foreigners, new men unknown to them. For in all nations of the world, the priests kept such doctrine secret, even from their own plebs, whence indeed it was everywhere called sacred doctrine, for sacred is as much as to say secret. And from this there emerges a most luminous proof of the truth of Christian religion, that Pythagoras and Plato, by grace of a most sublime human science, had exalted themselves to some extent to the knowledge of the divine truths, which the Hebrews had been taught by the true God. And on the other hand, there arises a weighty confutation of the errors of recent mythologists, who believe that the fables are sacred stories corrupted by the Gentile nations, and especially by the Greeks. And although the Egyptians had dealings with the Hebrews in their captivity, yet by a custom common to primitive peoples, as we shall show later, namely that of holding the conquered to be men without gods, they rather mocked than heeded the Hebrew religion and history. Often, as the sacred book of Genesis narrates, they scornfully asked the Hebrews why the God they adored did not come to liberate them from their hands. Section 35. Servius Tullius king, year of the world 3468, and of Rome, year 225. Paragraph 96. By a common error, it has hitherto been believed that this king set up the census in Rome as a basis of popular liberty, whereas we shall see that the census was a basis of patrician liberty. And this error is in accord with that one according to which it has been believed up to now that, in those times in which the sick debtor had to appear on an ass or in a cart before the praetor, Tarquinius Priscus ordained the insignia, togas, devices, and chairs of ivory, made of the tusks of elephants, which, because the Romans had first seen them in Lucania in the war with Pyrrhus, they called Lucanian oxen, and finally the triumphal golden chariot, in which splendid equipage the Roman majesty shone brightest in times of the popular commonwealth. Section 36. Hesiod, year of the world, 3500. Paragraph 97. By the proofs we shall advance concerning the time when vulgar writing was introduced among the Greeks, we put Hesiod about the time of Herodotus, or a little before. The chronologists, with too much boldness, put him 30 years before Homer, on whose period the authorities vary by as much as 460 years. Besides, Porphyry, according to Suidas, and Velleius Paterculus state that Homer preceded Hesiod by a great length of time. As for the tripod that Hesiod consecrated to Apollo on Helicon, with the inscription that he had surpassed Homer in song, although Varro accepts it, according to Aulus Gellius, it is to be kept in the Museum of Imposture, for it is a hoax similar to those perpetrated in our day by the falsifiers of metals, who seek by such deceit to reap a rich profit. Section 37. Herodotus, Hippocrates, year of the world, 3500. Paragraph 98. Hippocrates is placed by the chronologists in the time of the 7 sages of Greece, but partly because his life is too much tinged with fable. He is said to be the son of Asclepius and grandson of Apollo, and partly because he is known to be the author of works written in prose with vulgar characters. He is here placed near the time of Herodotus, who likewise wrote prose with vulgar characters, and wove his history almost entirely out of fables. Section 38. Edanthrius, king of Scythia, year of the world, 3530. Paragraph 99. This king answered Darius the Great, who had threatened to make war on him, with 5 real words, which, as we shall later show, the first peoples must have used before they came to vocal words, and finally to written ones. These real words were a frog, a mouse, a bird, a plowshare, and a bow for shooting arrows. Further on, we shall show the nature and proper meaning of these objects. It would be tedious to report that St. Cyril of Alexandria relates of the council that Darius held to discuss the meaning of this reply, for the interpretations his counselors put upon it are obviously ridiculous. And this Edenthrius was the king of those Scythians who surpassed the Egyptians in point of antiquity. And yet that late epoch did not even know how to write with hieroglyphs. Edenthrius must have been like one of those Chinese kings who, up to a few centuries ago, cut off from the rest of the world, vainly boast an antiquity greater than that of the world, and, after so long a time, are still found writing with hieroglyphs, and although on account of the great mildness of the climate, they have most refined talents, and make so many marvelously delicate things, do not yet know how to make shadows in painting, against which highlights can stand out. Whence, since it is neither relief nor depth, their painting is most crude. And as for the statuettes of porcelain, which come from there, they show the Chinese to be just as unskilled as the Egyptians were in casting, whence it may be inferred that the Egyptians were as unskilled in painting as the Chinese are now. Paragraph 100. To these Scythians belongs Anacharsis, author of the Scythian oracles, as Zoroaster was of the Chaldean. They must have first been the oracles of soothsayers, which later, by the vanity of the learned, were turned into oracles of philosophers. From the Hyperboreans of Scythia, either this one or another born anciently within Greece itself, there came to Greece the most famous oracles of the Gentiles, the Delphic and the Dodonian. So Herodotus believed, and after him Pindar and Pherenicus, who are followed by Cicero on his On the Nature of the Gods. This may explain why Anacharsis was proclaimed a famous author of oracles, and numbered among the most ancient soothsaying gods, as we shall see in the section on poetic geography. Meanwhile, to show how learned Scythia was in esoteric wisdom, let it suffice that the Scythians would stick a knife in the ground and adore it as a god, in order to justify the killings they are about to perform. From this wild religion emerged all the civil and moral virtues narrated by Diodorus Siculus, Justin, Pliny, and lauded to the skies by Horace. Thence Arabis, i.e. Anarchus, wishing to order Scythia by the laws of Greece, was killed by Caduidus his brother. Such was his profit from the barbarian philosophy of Van Hern, that he did not discern by himself the laws needed to bring a barbarian people to a humane civilization, but had to learn from them the Greeks. For the very same thing is true of the Greeks in relation to the Scythians, which we have said of them a while ago, in paragraph 90, in relation to the Egyptians, that by their vanity and giving to their knowledge high-sounding origins of foreign antiquity, they truly deserve the reproof they represented the Egyptian priest as giving to Solon, as related by Critias in the first or second Alcibiades of Plato, namely that the Greeks had always been children. And so it must be said that by this vanity the Greeks, in relation both to the Scythians and to the Egyptians, lost as much in real merit as they gained in vainglory. Section 39. Peloponnesian War. Thucydides, who writes that up to his father's day the Greeks knew nothing of their own antiquities, therefore set himself to write of this war. Year of the World 3530. Paragraph 101. Thucydides was a young man at the time when Herodotus, who might have been his father, was already old. He lived in the most glorious age of Greece, which was that of the Peloponnesian War, and since he was a contemporary of this struggle, he wrote its history in order to write of true things. By him it was said that down to his father's time, which was also that of Herodotus, the Greeks knew nothing of their own antiquities. What then could we think of the things that they wrote of the barbarians? And we must know of ancient barbarian history only what they tell us. And what must we think of the antiquities of the Romans, up to the time of the Carthaginian wars, in view of the fact that until then they had been concerned only with agriculture and military affairs, when Thucydides establishes this truth about his own Greeks, who so promptly came forth as philosophers, unless perhaps we are willing to say that the Romans had had some particular privilege from God. Section 40. Socrates originates rational moral philosophy. Plato flourishes in metaphysics. Athens is resplendent with all the arts of the most cultivated humanity. Law of the 12 Tables. Year of the world 3553, and of Rome, year 303. Paragraph 102. At this time there is brought from Athens to Rome the law of the 12 Tables, just as crude, inhuman, cruel, uncivilized, and monstrous as it is shown to be in our principles of universal law. Section 41. Xenophon, carrying the Greek arms into the heart of Persia, is the first to learn of Persian things with any certainty. Year of the world 3583, and of Rome, year 333. Paragraph 103. Thus St. Jerome observes in his commentary on Daniel, just as the Greeks had begun under Psammetichus to learn something of Egypt by way of commerce, so that Herodotus's more reliable information about the Egyptians begins with that period, so now, starting from Xenophon, they began through the exigencies of war to learn more reliable things about the Persians. Even Aristotle, who accompanied Alexander the Great into Persia, writes that before that time the Greeks had but told fables about them, as we have indicated in this chronological table. In this way the Greeks began to have some real knowledge of the affairs of other peoples. Section 42. Publilian Law. Year of the world 3658, and of Rome, year 416. Paragraph 104. This law was put into effect in the 416th year of Rome, and contains a most important point of Roman history, for by this law the Roman Commonwealth declared its change from an aristocratic to a popular form of government. Whence Publilius Philo, who was its author, was called the people's dictator. This has not been noticed because the language of the law has not been properly understood. We shall later make evident that this was the fact. Here it will suffice to give a hypothetical idea of it. Paragraph 105. This law and the subsequent Petelian law, which is of equal importance, remained unknown because of these three words which are not defined: people, kingdom, and liberty. Because of these words it has been commonly but erroneously believed that the Roman people, from the time of Romulus, had been composed of citizens both noble and plebeian, that the Roman kingdom had been monarchical, and that the liberty set up by Brutus had been a popular liberty. And these three words, not properly defined, have led into error all the critics, historians, political theorists, and jurists, because from none of these words could they get a clear idea of the heroic commonwealths, which were of a most severe aristocratic form, and therefore entirely different from those of our time. Paragraph 106. In an asylum opened in the forest, Romulus founded Rome on the clientships and protectorships under which the fathers of families maintained as day laborers in the fields those who had fled to this asylum. These fugitives had no privilege of citizenship, and thus no share of civil liberty. Since they had taken refuge with the fathers to save their lives, the fathers protected their natural liberty by setting them separately to the cultivation of their several fields. The public domain of the Roman territory must have been made up of these fields, just as Romulus constituted the Senate from the fathers themselves. Paragraph 107. Later, Servius Tullius granted the workers bonetary ownership of the fields that were the property of the fathers and imposed the census tax upon them. They were to do their own cultivating under the burden of the census, and with the obligation of serving the fathers in war at their own expense, as in fact the plebeians did serve the patricians under what has hitherto been mistaken for popular liberty. This law of Servius Tullius was the first agrarian law of the world, and it set up the census as the basis of the heroic commonwealths. that is to say, of the most ancient aristocracies of all the nations. Paragraph 108. Subsequently, Junius Brutus, casting out the Tarquin tyrants, restored the Roman Commonwealth to its original form, and by setting up the consuls, as it were, an annual pair of aristocratic kings, as Cicero calls them in his laws, in place of one king for life, re-established the liberty of the patricians as against their tyrants, but not indeed the liberty of the people from under the patricians. But since the nobles did not keep faith with the plebeians under the agrarian law of Servius Tullius, the plebs brought about the creation of the plebeian tribunes, and had them accepted under oath by the nobility. The tribunes were to protect for the people that degree of natural liberty represented by monetary ownership of the fields. Thus, when the plebeians were wanting to secure civil ownership from the nobles, the plebeian tribunes drove from Rome Marcius Coriolanus, because he had said that the plebeians should go and till the soil. That is, since they were not content with the agrarian law of Servius, but wanted a fuller and stronger one, they should be reduced again to the day laborers they had been under Romulus. For if this be not a true picture of things, how can we explain the foolish pride of the plebs in disdaining agriculture, since we know that even the patricians deemed it honorable work? And would such a slight pretext have occasioned such a cruel war? For Marcius, to avenge his exile, would have brought about the ruin of Rome, had it not been for the piteous tears of his mother and his wife, which turned him aside from his impious enterprise. Paragraph 109. In consequence of all this, the nobles proceeding to take back the fields from the plebs after they had cultivated them, and the latter having no civil action for laying claims to them, the plebeian tribunes now appealed to a law of the 12 tables, by which, as is demonstrated in the principles of universal law, no other affair but this was settled. By this law the nobles conceded to the plebs the hereditary ownership of the fields. This civil ownership is permitted to foreigners by the natural law of nations, and this was the second agrarian law of the ancient nations. Paragraph 110. Now when the plebeians saw, on the one hand, that they could not transmit the fields intestate to their kin, because they had no sui heredis, agnates or Gentiles, to which relations legitimate succession was then confined, since their marriages were not solemnized, and on the other hand, that they could not even dispose of the fields by testament, because they did not have the rights of citizens, they demanded for themselves the connubium of the nobles, that is, the right to solemnized marriages, for such is the meaning of connubium. The most solemn part of the marriage service was the auspices, which were the property of the nobles. These auspices indeed were the great source of all Roman law, private and public, and thus the right of contracting marriages was communicated to the plebeians by the fathers. Since marriage is, by the definition of the jurisconsult Modestinus, the sharing of every divine and human right, and since citizenship itself is naught else, the fathers thereby gave the plebeians the rights of citizenship. Then, in the natural course of human desires, the plebeians, which depended upon the auspices as patria potestas sui heredis, agnation, and clan membership, and in the consequence of these rights, the further rights of legitimate succession, the making of testaments and of guardianship. Then they claimed those dependent rights of public law, securing the communication first of the imperium by the opening to them of the consulship, and finally of the science of the laws by the opening to them of priesthood and pontificate. Paragraph 111. In this way the tribunes of the plebs, by pursuing the function for which they were created, that of protecting the natural liberty of the plebeians, were gradually led to secure for them the whole range of civil liberty as well. And the census ordered by Servius Tullius, with the subsequent provision that payment should no longer be made to the nobles privately, but to the public treasury, so that the treasury might supply to the plebeians the expenses of war, developed naturally from a basis of liberty for the lords into a basis of popular liberty. Further on we shall see the way in which this came about. Paragraph 112. By a parallel development, these same tribunes progressed in the power of making laws. For the Horatian and Hortensian laws could not grant to the plebs that their plebiscites should be binding upon all people except in two special emergencies. In the first of these, the plebs had retired to the Aventine in the 304th year of Rome, at which time, as we state here by way of hypothesis, and shall later show as a fact, the plebeians were not yet citizens. In the second, they retired to the Janiculum in the 367th year of Rome, at which time the plebs were still struggling with the nobility for the sharing of the consulate. But on the basis of the two aforesaid laws, the plebs finally reached the point where they could make universal laws, binding on the nobles as well as on themselves. To bring this about required factional movements and revolts at Rome, with the result that it was necessary to make Publilius Philo dictator, an office never created save times of greatest danger to the commonwealth, such as this was, for it had fallen into such great disorder as to nourish within itself two supreme legislative powers, without any distinction of time, scope, or territory, with the result that the commonwealth was on the point of collapse. Wherefore Philo, to cure the ills of the state, ordained that whatever the plebs commanded by plebiscites and the assembly by tribes should be binding on all the quirites, i.e., should be binding on all the peoples in the assembly by hundreds, in which the quirites met. For the Romans called themselves quirites only in public assembly, and quiris in the singular is never found in common Latin speech. By this formula, Philo meant to signify that laws could not be enacted contrary to the plebiscites. The plebs had already been made in all respects equal to the nobles by law, to which the latter had agreed. By this most recent move, to which the nobles could offer no opposition without bringing the commonwealth to ruin, the plebs had become superior to the nobles, for without ratification by the Senate, the plebs could enact general laws for all the people. Thus the Roman Commonwealth had now naturally become free and popular. Philo accordingly proclaimed it such by this law, and hence was called the people's dictator. Paragraph 113. In conformity with this change in its nature, he gave the Commonwealth two ordinances which are contained in the other two sections of the Publilian law. In the first, this dictator ordained that authorization by the Senate, which had been an authorization by the lords, whereby what had first been decided by the people, the fathers had afterwards to ratify, so that the election of the consuls and the enacting of the laws, being determined in advance by the people, had been respectively public testimonials of merit and public demands of right, should therefore be given by the fathers to the people, who were now sovereign and free, prior to the deliberation of the assembly, as if they, the fathers, were but guardians of the people, who were the real lords and masters of the Roman imperium. The people, if they wished to enact laws, were to do so according to the formula presented to them by the Senate. If not, they could make use of their sovereign right and antiquate the proposed laws, that is, declare that they wanted no innovation. Thus everything the Senate should henceforth ordain concerning public affairs should be regarded as instructions given by it to the people or commissions given to it by the people. Finally, there remained the census, for since the treasury had hitherto been the property of the nobles, they alone had been created censors of it. Since, however, by this law the treasury became the property of the people as a whole, Philo ordered in the third place that the censorship, the only magistry in which the plebs had as yet no share, should also be extended to them. Paragraph 114. If we read further into the history of Rome in the light of this hypothesis, we shall find by 1,000 proofs that it provides a foundation for all the things therein narrated, which have lacked a common foundation and a proper and particular connection among themselves, because the three aforesaid words were undefined. Wherefore this hypothesis should be accepted as true. However, if properly considered, this is not so much a hypothesis as a truth meditated in idea, which later will be authoritatively shown to be the fact. and granted Livy's generalization that the asylums were an old council of founders of cities, as Romulus founded the city of Rome within the asylum opened in the forest. This hypothesis gives us also the history of all the other cities of the world in times we have so far despaired of knowing. This then is an instance of an ideal eternal history, which will be later meditated and discovered, whose course is run in time by the histories of all nations. Section 43. Petelian Law, Year of the World 3661, and of Rome, year 419. Paragraph 115. This second law, called On Slavery for Debt, De Nexu, was enacted in the year of Rome 419, and thus 3 years after the Publilian Law, by the consuls of Caius Putelius and Lucius Papirius Mugellanus. It contains another most important point in the study of Roman affairs, for by this law the plebeians were released from the feudal liability of becoming liege vassals of the nobles on account of debts, for which the nobles used to compel the plebeians to work for them, often for life, in their private prisons. But the Senate retained the sovereign power it had over the lands of the Roman Imperium, though the Imperium itself had already passed to the people, and under the provisions of the Senatus Consultum, which was called the Last, the Senate kept this power for itself by force of arms, as long as the Roman Commonwealth remained free. Thus, whenever the people wanted to dispose of these lands under the agrarian laws of the Gracchi, the Senate armed the consuls, who prescribed as rebels and executed the tribunes of the plebs, who had been the authors of these laws. This great effect could only be brought about by a system of sovereign fiefs, subject to a higher sovereignty. This system is confirmed by a passage in one of the Catiline orations of Cicero, where he affirms that Tiberius Gracchus, by his agrarian law, was destroying the form of government of the Commonwealth, and had hence been rightfully put to death by Publilius Scipio Nasica, on the ground set forth in the formula by which the consul armed the people against the authors of the aforesaid law. Quote, "Whoever is for the safety of the Commonwealth, let him follow the consul." End quote. Section 44. War with Tarentum, wherein the Latins and the Greeks begin to know each other. Year of the World 3708, and of Rome, year 489. Paragraph 116. The reason for this war was the maltreatment accorded to the Tarentines to the Roman ships which landed on their coasts, and likewise to the Roman ambassadors. Their excuse, as phrased by Florus, was that they did not know who the Romans were or whence they came. So well acquainted were the first peoples, even when they were not separated by water, and were not far apart by land. Section 45. Second Carthaginian War, with which begins the period of Roman history known with some certainty by Livy, though he professes to be ignorant of 3 important circumstances. Year of the World 3849, and of Rome, year 552. Paragraph 117. Livy proposed to write the history of Rome with more certainty from the period of the Carthaginian War, and promised to describe the most memorable of all wars fought by the Romans. And because of its incomparable greatness, the chronicles he writes of it should have the greater certainty that belongs to things of greater fame. Yet he did not know, and openly admits he did not know, 3 most important circumstances. The first, and whose consulship Hannibal, after the capture of Saguntum, had started on his march from Spain to Italy. The second, over which Alps he had come to the Cottian or Pennine. And the third, what strength he had with him. On this last matter there was in the ancient annals such a wide diversity of opinion that some had written 6,000 cavalry and 20,000 infantry, others 20,000 cavalry and 80,000 infantry. Conclusion. Paragraph 118. It can be seen by our reasoning in these notes that all that has come down to us from the ancient Gentile nations for the times covered by this table is most uncertain. So that in all this we have entered as it were into a no man's land, where the rule of law obtains that the first occupant acquires title. For this reason we trust that we shall offend no man's right if we often reason differently and at times in direct opposition to the opinions which have been held up to now concerning the beginnings of the humanity of the nations. By so doing, we shall reduce these beginnings to scientific principles, by which the facts of certain history may be assigned to their first origins, on which they rest and by which they are reconciled. For up to now they do not seem to have had any common foundation, nor any continuous sequence, nor any coherence among themselves. This is the end of Section 1 from The New Science of Giambattista Vico. In the next video, we will proceed to Section 2, titled Elements, beginning with paragraph 119. Thank you for listening.